My name is Adara Goldberg, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holocaust Resource Center here at Kane University. We want to thank you first and foremost for being here with us tonight for our annual Murray Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture. So big thank you. On behalf of myself and Sarah Kuykendall, our Assistant Director, we want to thank you for all that you do in honor of Holocaust education and remembrance. Tonight's program is a very important one to us, and I am so proud to be standing here, in this role, seeing all of you here for the sole purpose of learning.
It's an honor to join you this evening to share a few words about my Zaidi, Yiddish for my grandfather, Murray Pantirer. May the memory of the righteous be a blessing, and also to introduce our keynote speakers. To the educators and students in the room, I am also an educator and also a student, in the way that to be an educator is to be a student. Thank you for your commitment to Holocaust education. I had the merit to hear my grandfather speak dozens of times in my life, and aside from him always saying, "God bless America," and Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live, he almost never said the same thing. Depending on the audience, he always customized his message. And so although I'm in an academic setting this evening, when I think about my grandfather's Holocaust experience and his legacy, what stands out to me is less the cities and the dates, but more the stories he shared, the lessons that he taught me. I think of the time that he was forced to dig pits to bury dead bodies, and he would look through the bodies to see if there were any friends or relatives. He came across a little girl on the verge of death, but still breathing. He asked a Nazi nearby for, in his words, a kind bullet to cease her suffering. But the Nazi responded, "For that piece of shit, it's not worth it. Bury her alive." This taught me the value of every human life and the importance of striving to treat every human being on the planet with dignity. I also think about the last time my grandfather's family was briefly reunited in the fall of 1941 in one room for 9 people. His mother, Bella Levenstein Pantirer, may the memory of the holy be a blessing, would cook for the children, but there was no food. They would say, "Ma, why don't you eat?" And she would say she wasn't hungry. This taught me what it means to be a parent, what it means to strive to devote yourself to your family no matter what. The obligation that I am blessed with for my 3 daughters and my son, Murray Pantirer Pines. May we never know anything like this ever again. I think of my Zaidi's father, Laser Pantirer, whose grandson Larry Pantirer is sitting right there. May the memory of the holy be a blessing. His mother Bella and his 2 youngest siblings, Yisrael, David, Tuvia, and Chaya Rachel. Ages 9 and 7. Their souls are in the Garden of Eden. When they were rounded up and the soldiers directed his father to one line to be sent to a labor camp and his mother and siblings to the other line to be murdered. Laser refused to leave his wife's side, and the 4 of them were killed on the spot. Laser holding one child and Bella holding the other. Worse still, when the fathers who chose not to stand and die alongside their children told my grandfather what happened when they met him later in the war, they shared how guilty and terrible they felt for not doing what Laser had done. This taught me that true evil seeks not only to destroy you, but seeks to put you in a position where all the choices before you are terrible, which is how I feel about my brothers and sisters in Israel right now. I think of an image I never heard from my grandfather, but from a stranger, a survivor who heard me speaking about my grandfather on a trip to Poland. In tears, he approached me and said, "You're Murray Pantirer's grandson? He used to sneak us soup in the camp. Once they caught him and they beat him almost to death." This taught me that any gift we receive, be it material or intrinsic, creates an obligation to help those in need. In my Zadie's own words, either you're in a position to help and you must, or you're in a position to need help and you ask for it. I strongly believe that we are all God's children, and he created the poor man to test the rich man, to make sure that he deserves what he gets. But I also think of the life my Zadie built after the Holocaust, with none of his 8 siblings alive, or his parents, and no country. How he found the love of his life, my Baba Lucy. May the memory of the righteous be a blessing. And how they were blessed to build a home and a family and a community here in the United States of America, nearby in Hillside, New Jersey. I think of the palpable excitement, joy, and energy my grandfather brought to every family occasion and milestone. This taught me to always choose life, to cherish life no matter what is happening to you. I think of Oskar Schindler, may he rest in peace, who saved my grandfather, who reminds us of the power of choice, that at every moment in our lives, every second, big or small, I have the power to make choices that will have ripple effects for all of eternity. And I think of my grandfather's commitment to telling the world about the Holocaust, from being a founding president of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and being appointed to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Council by both Presidents Reagan and Bush, to being founding president of the Holocaust Research Foundation, and to his experience of having many of his stories told through the film Schindler's List. And so in the coming moments, we will hear another story. We will have the honor of learning about the life and choices of Dr. Josephine Janina Mehlberg. May the memory of the righteous be a blessing. A Jewish mathematician who saved thousands of lives in Nazi-occupied Poland by masquerading as a Polish Christian countess. Our keynote speakers this evening, Dr. Elizabeth Barry White and Dr. Joanna Sliwa, I got it, are the authors of The Counterfeit Countess, the Jewish woman who rescued thousands of Poles during the Holocaust. Dr. Elizabeth Barry White recently retired from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she served as historian and as research director for its Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Prior to working for the Holocaust Museum, Barry spent a career at the U.S. Department of Justice working on investigations and prosecutions of Nazi criminals and other human rights violators. She served as Deputy Director and Chief Historian of the Office of Special Investigations and as Deputy Chief and Chief Historian of the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section. Dr. Joanna Sliwa is a historian at the Conference on Jewish Materials Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference in New York, where she also administers academic programs. She previously worked at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. She has taught Holocaust and Jewish history at Kean University and at Rutgers University, and has served as a historical consultant and researcher, including for the PBS film In the Name of Their Mothers, the story of Irina Sendler. Her first book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust, won the 2020 Ernst Frankel Prize awarded by the Wiener Holocaust Library. Before she was Dr. Sliwa, she used to attend the Murray Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture as an undergraduate and then graduate student, and had a close relationship with Holocaust Resource Center co-founder Clara Kramer. May her memory be a blessing. So it was an extra special treat to welcome her back. It is an honor, truly, to have both of you here tonight, to thank you for the work you've done and for the important story that you've brought to life for the first time. My hope is that as modeled by my grandfather, Murray Pantirer, we will each walk out of this room differently than how we walked in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin, for these powerful words, and thank you so much for your generous introduction of Barry and of me. Good evening. Barry and I are honored and extremely grateful for the invitation to give the Murray Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture. We thank Dr. Adara Goldberg, Sarah Kuykendall, and everyone who made this event possible. Thank you all so much for being here in person, and as I understand, others are tuning in via Zoom. It is a special honor for me to stand on this stage. As an undergraduate student and later a master's student at Kean University, I attended many programs organized by the Holocaust Resource Center. At one of those lectures, I met Professor Deborah Dwork. At the time, she was the director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, where Dr. Goldberg and I received our PhDs. Many years later, Professor Dwork connected Barry and me. And this introduction paved the way for us to collaborate on an astonishing story of survival and resistance during the Holocaust. You are looking at a photograph of Professor Josephine Janina Mehlberg. For the rest of this talk, Barry and I will refer to her simply as Janina. This photo was captured in the 1960s while Janina was teaching a class at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Janina was a unicorn at that time, a woman who was a tenured full professor of mathematics. Her husband, Henry Mehlberg, a philosopher of physics, was a professor at the University of Chicago. The Mehlbergs led a comfortable life in Chicago. They entertained regularly, and they developed a close circle of scholars. Henry sometimes suffered from a nervous or a mental condition. Their colleagues and students suspected that this was an effect of some wartime trauma, but they did not know how Henry survived the Holocaust. Henry did occasionally let slip that Janina was a hero of the Polish resistance, and that she saved him. And this, in turn, led people to assume that Janina was not Jewish. Barry and I spoke with a few students who visited the Mehlbergs' home. They remembered Janina as an elegant Polish lady and a brilliant scholar. And she was both, of course. But she also had another identity, an unusual background, and an extraordinary story of surviving the Holocaust and World War II. Murray Pantirer, about whom we just have heard from Justin, and in whose honor this lecture is named, was one of 1,200 Jews saved by Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a non-Jewish German, an industrialist, and a Nazi Party member. He used his status to protect the Jewish workers who toiled in his plant in Krakow, the capital of German-occupied Poland, which the Germans also called the general government. And you see that area in the light area on the map. Janina Mehlberg was a different kind of rescuer. She was a Polish Jewish woman who assumed a false identity of a Polish Christian countess. She used this status as her survival strategy, and she used her position to join the Polish resistance, become a key person in a Polish welfare organization, and to help non-Jewish Poles. She saved at least 10,000 people in the Polish city of Lublin. Janina never spoke publicly of her life before she escaped from Poland to Canada in 1950. Not long before her death in 1969, she recorded in a memoir some of what she did and witnessed during the war. After she died, Henry translated this memoir into English, hoping to get it published, but he did not succeed. Shortly before his death in 1979, he gave the memoir to his colleague from the University of Florida. Henry asked this historian to find a publisher for his wife's memoir.
In 1989, I gave an academic conference paper on Majdanek, an SS concentration camp in German-occupied Lublin, Poland. After the panel, a historian I didn't know handed me a carbon copy manuscript. Whoops. And here you can see the first page of it with the contact information of the historian Arthur Funk at the University of Florida. He said this was the memoir of Polish-Jewish mathematician Janina Mehlberg, who helped prisoners at Majdanek while pretending to be a Polish Christian aristocrat. So he had not been able to get this memoir published. He was going to donate it to a couple of archives, but he really wanted me to take this copy because I was writing about Majdanek and he hoped I could make the memoir story known. I read that story and I was utterly flabbergasted. Janina Mehlberg claimed that she survived the Holocaust in German-occupied Poland under the false identity of the Countess Suchodolska. In this guise, as an aristocrat, she became a key official of a Polish relief organization. The Germans allowed this organization to operate in Lublin, but only to help non-Jewish Poles. It seemed from her memoir that she was stubbornly persistent in her negotiations. She never accepted no as a final answer, even went over officials' heads. And when she finally got to yes, she considered it an invitation to ask for even more. This slide shows on the right, you can see a map of the city of Lublin, and right on its edge on a major road, Majdanek. And there are a couple of views of Majdanek here. In the top one, in the distance, you can see the chimney of the crematorium. At Majdanek, Janina relentlessly pestered the SS to let her organization bring in ever greater quantities of supplies for thousands of prisoners at Majdanek. She even got to bring in decorated Christmas trees and Easter eggs. This did not happen at any other concentration camp. She brought these supplies herself into the camp. Here you can see that Majdanek had 5 prisoner compounds called fields. She persuaded the SS to let her bring her deliveries right up to the gate of each of these compounds, where she could interact furtively with the prisoners unloading them. So she used those deliveries as cover to smuggle messages, supplies, even weapons to members of the resistance imprisoned in the camp, because she was also an officer in the Armia Krajowa, the home army of the Polish resistance. Now, I knew that Lublin was the headquarters of the largest murder operation of the Holocaust, Operation Reinhardt. The SS murdered most of its 1.7 million Jewish victims in the killing centers of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. But 63,000 were murdered at Majdanek in its gas chambers and shooting pits. In this aerial photo, you can see up here is the prisoner compound marked Field 1 in the earlier slide, and there's a U-shaped building right across from it. That's where the gas chambers were housed. Every time Janina brought her deliveries into the camp, she passed by that building. And according to her memoir, she knew what was happening to Jews there. So the claim that she, as a Jewish woman, went almost daily into this den of mass murder and smuggled contraband under the noses of the SS seemed to me almost too fantastic to be true. There was a Countess Suchodolska who did perform resistance and relief activities at Majdanek, but there was no evidence that she was not who she said she was, much less was a Jew. I couldn't use this memoir without first verifying it, and I had no way to do that. The Mehlbergs were dead, they had no children, I couldn't go off to do research in Polish archives, and anyway, I don't know Polish. So I figured another historian would find the memoir in the archives and do what was necessary to bring it to light. But years and years passed, that didn't happen. And I never forgot this incredible story, because if it was true, it needed to be told. And I worried whether I had a responsibility to see that that happened. In 2017, I really started digging into who this Janina Mehlberg was. And I didn't have a lot to go on at first, mainly what Henry wrote in the preface, you saw the first page of it, to the memoir. And based on that, I believed that she was born in 1915 as Janina Spinner. And I thought I confirmed that when I got hold of her U.S. immigration records. But then I came across two photos of Henry with his fellow philosophy students in 1925. A woman appears in each, identified in one as Peppy Spinner and in the other as Josefa Mehlberg. This clearly had to be Janina Mehlberg, and she clearly is not 10 years old, which she would have been if she'd been born in 1915. Finally, with the help of 3 Polish scholars, I learned that she was born Peppy Spinner in 1905. So she lied to U.S. authorities. Was that reason to doubt the credibility of the memoir? Finally, though, I found a reference in a 1975 book review that made me think she might have been Countess Suchodolska. And so I talked with Deborah Dwork and said, do you know an expert on the Holocaust in Poland who might be able to take on this project? And she introduced me to Joanna.
Who was this Countess Janina Suchodolska before she assumed the false identity of a Polish aristocrat? And I need my clicker. Yes, thank you. Okay. Here we have another map. Janina grew up in a small town in the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual borderlands. Today, this area is part of Ukraine, but between the 2 world wars, this was part of Poland. Her father was a wealthy landowner who mingled with the local nobility, and that is how Janina absorbed the languages, the mannerisms, the customs of the upper classes. She was also very gifted in math. In the 1920s, she obtained a master's degree in mathematics, studying under 2 leading mathematicians at the time, and this was at the university in Lvov, today Lviv, Ukraine. However, she found that it was almost impossible for her as a woman to get a PhD in mathematics, and my clicker is not working. Okay, we got it. So she studied instead under a philosopher at the university who welcomed mathematicians and scientists, as well as women and Jews among his students. Janina obtained a PhD at the age of 22, and you see her with the arrow, and right next to her standing is her professor. Janina and Henry married in 1933. They had teaching positions in their beloved Lvov, and they were very active in its intellectual circles. Then World War II began. In September 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland in half. As you can see, Lvov fell to the Soviet occupation. Janina and Henry survived the Soviets, only to face far worse when German forces occupied the city in June 1941. From that moment on, the Mehlbergs faced the constant threat of violence and murder. On one occasion, Janina barely saved Henry from a mass shooting. More than 100,000 Jews lived in Lviv at the time. When the Germans ordered all of them to move into a ghetto, the Mehlbergs understood that they would not survive. In December 1941, a family friend, Count Andrzej Skrzyński, arrived in Lviv. He was serving in the Polish resistance and assured the Mehlbergs that if they traveled back with him to Lublin, he would get them false identity papers. And here you can see the Count long after the war, so now we know that he survived. Once the Mehlbergs and Count Skrzyński arrived in Lublin, the Mehlbergs became Countess Janina and Count Piotr Suchodolski. Janina soon discovered that even as supposed ethnic Poles, she and Henry were still not safe. And that was because the Nazis considered ethnic Poles to be subhuman racial enemies, only a little better than the Jews. The Germans systematically destroyed signs of Polish culture. They murdered members of the Polish intelligentsia. They abducted 2 million Poles for forced labor in the Reich. And they conducted brutal ethnic cleansing campaigns. The German occupation of Poland cost the lives of 3 million Polish Jews and nearly 2 million non-Jewish Poles. In March 1942, Janina, along with the residents of Lublin, witnessed the bloody deportation action of 35,000 Jews from Lublin's ghetto. And on this slide here, you see images from that ghetto. This was the first action of Operation Reinhard, the largest murder operation of the Holocaust, with headquarters in Lublin, where Janina lived and operated. Janina realized that she and Henry would probably not long survive. So she decided to stop living in constant helpless fear. Instead, she would devote whatever was left of her life to resisting the German occupiers and to helping her Polish compatriots. With Skrzyński's sponsorship, Janina joined the Polish resistance. Skrzyński was also the top official of the Polish main welfare organization in the Lublin district, which was known by its Polish initials, RGO, and so I will be referring to it as RGO. The general government's rulers had no wish to provide for non-Aryans, so they established 3 separate social welfare organizations, one for ethnic Ukrainians, another for ethnic Poles, and another for Jews. The RGO ran soup kitchens, orphanages, clinics, supplied food and medicine for Poles in prisons and labor camps, and found shelter for victims of ethnic cleansing campaigns. Skrzyński hired Janina as his right hand in the Lublin RGO. The Lublin RGO won permission from the SS to deliver food and medicines to Polish prisoners in the Majdanek concentration camp. And who was put in charge? Janina. She became obsessed with finding ways to help all of Majdanek's prisoners, including the Jews, no matter the risks to herself. She dreamed of delivering enough food to stave off starvation and of providing medicine and serum that would help eradicate the raging epidemics in the camp. And she wanted to do more to strengthen the prisoners' will to survive by letting them know that they were not forgotten and by giving them hope. By the fall of 1943, Janina was conducting many of the RGO's negotiations with German officials in Lublin. For example, she insisted that the Germans follow regulations for releasing hostages and exempting certain Poles from being taken for forced labor. She won the release from transit and labor camps of Poles who were unable to work. She also enabled her fellow resistance members to go into the camps posing as relief workers. And their task was to instruct the prisoners on specific symptoms so that they could report them and then get released from the camp. Based on wartime archival records, we documented that Janina negotiated the release from German captivity of over 9,700 ethnic Poles. More than 4,000 of them were from Majdanek. In November 1943, Majdanek received a new commandant. He had orders to reduce the mortality rate in the camp. Janina immediately presented herself as an ally in this effort. The commandant's prisoners would stay healthy and work longer if they received adequate food rations and medicine, and she could make that happen. At their first meeting, the commandant agreed that the RGO could provide soup for hundreds of sick prisoners. Janina left the meeting thinking that the commandant does not yet realize that when I ask for a finger, I mean to get the whole hand. And she nearly did. By February 1944, the RGO was delivering tons of food and hundreds of gallons of soup for 4,000 prisoners, 5 days a week. As Janina had hoped, the Poles were receiving enough food so that some were sharing their rations with other non-Polish prisoners. Not with the Jews, though. The SS had shot all 18,000 Jewish prisoners in Majdanek on November 3rd, 1943. Janina was probably the first Polish civilian to learn about this massacre.
There are many vivid, riveting scenes in Janina's memoir that we incorporate in our book. I'm going to read a passage that shows how Janina typically dealt with German officials. It deals with her first meeting in May 1944 with a new commandant at Majdanek. He was Arthur Liebehenschel, previously the commandant of Auschwitz, and before that, the number 2 official in the entire SS concentration camp system. As soon as he got to Majdanek, he banned the delivery of any aid to the prisoners, and he threatened to arrest any RGO employee who entered the camp. But Janina insisted on meeting with him and got an appointment. When she entered his office, he was standing at a window with his back to her and refused to acknowledge her presence, even when she greeted him. Acting as if the situation were perfectly natural, Janina began explaining the purpose of her visit. Suddenly, the commandant erupted. "What do you think you're doing here?" he screamed, still facing the window. "Do you imagine this is a sanitarium for bandits and enemies of our country? Is that why you keep coming here, as if it were a drawing room or something? Feeding these criminals, as if they were the most precious people on earth. This is sheer Polish insolence. Don't you know that this is a concentration camp? Do you think it's a mess hall for gentlemen? You and your committee," he spat. "We should look into your activities. We should investigate all of you, including your precious charges, those darlings that you're feeding with such dedication. Why, they look much better off than our soldiers. They're healthy and strong, don't do a stitch of work all day long, and are being fed like princes." Janina was all too familiar with such tantrums from German officials. After Liebehenschel's tirade ended, she moved to the other window in the office and, with her back to him, calmly continued. "We are an institution approved by the German authorities to care for the needy among the Polish population, and whatever we have done in Majdanek has been with the agreement of the camp administration." "Not anymore," Liebehenschel barked. Janina was not about to back down. "Perhaps if there's no need for soup now, we could just send some packages," she suggested reasonably. "You Polacks!" he shrieked, expressing all his scorn and loathing with the pejorative term. "We throw you out one door and presto, you come in by another." Then, nonplussed by Janina's cool persistence, he shouted, "I can't hear what you're mumbling there. You're talking to the window." Janina turned. "And I don't hear you too well either, Herr Kommandant, and perhaps that is why we can't seem to come to an understanding." At that, Liebehenschel turned to face her for the first time, and after studying her for a moment, gestured for her to sit down. Janina proceeded to explain to the commandant how the RGO's help would be to his advantage as well. You have said yourself, she pointed out, that the people still here were kept to maintain order in the camp. You surely realize that well-fed workers are more efficient than underfed ones. If you consider soup superfluous, I won't insist on it. I could provide packages instead. He gave up and said gruffly, "Packages all right, but no luxuries."
Against the odds, Henry and Janina survived the war. In July 1944, the Red Army drove the Germans out of Lublin. The Soviet secret police immediately began hunting down members of the Polish resistance. Lublin's communist rulers accused the RGO of collaborating with the Germans, and Count Andrzej Skrzynski had to flee from the city. But the new government still needed the RGO's services, and they asked Janina to stay on. She decided it was still too dangerous to reveal her true identity, and so she became Dr. Janina Suchodolska, social worker. And she quickly rose to be the deputy director of Poland's National Social Welfare Agency. Henry, on the other hand, longed to resume to his academic career. So he reverted to his original name, and he began working at one of Polish universities. He learned that most of his family had been murdered in the Holocaust, but 2 of his brothers survived. And you see these are exceptional, special photos, postwar photos of Janina, Henry, his 2 brothers, and the brothers' wives. But soon, anti-Semitic violence persuaded all of them that they needed to leave Poland. Through her work, Janina had contacts with foreign and international organizations. She used them to get a United Nations fellowship to come to the United States. Local newspapers reported on the visit of an important official from communist Poland who was a woman. The purpose of Janina's fellowship was to study child welfare services, but her goal was bigger. She wanted to establish contacts with American academics to secure a position for her husband, Henry. That is how Henry managed to get to Canada in 1949. It took nearly a year and a half, but somehow Janina managed to escape from Poland. She defected at the Canadian military mission in Berlin, and she soon joined Henry in Canada. And here you can see her enjoying her newly won freedom in Canada.
Joanna and I are Holocaust historians. Between us, we've reviewed probably thousands of Holocaust victims' diaries, memoirs, testimonies, and oral histories. And we have never come across a story like Janina's. It's not just that she was a Jew who saved thousands of non-Jews, but that she did so in large part by negotiating face-to-face with Nazi officials, many of them mass murderers of Jews. And so here you can see just a few of the Nazi officials that she dealt with. I don't have but here you can see highlighted is Hermann Höfle. So he is the SS official who actually helped Janina win the release of several thousand Polish prisoners from Majdanek. And as you can see, he was also the manager of Operation Reinhardt. So when Janina was meeting one-on-one with him, he already had the blood of more than 1.5 million Jews on his hands. Janina, of course, did not work alone, and her memoir pays tribute to the Poles who risked their lives alongside her to resist the Nazis and to help each other survive. Many of them were women, and like Janina, they deserve to be recognized as heroes of the Polish resistance. Our book tells some of their stories. For example, second from the right, Saturnina Malm was the person who developed the first successful smuggling organization for getting medicines and messages into Majdanek. She also one day saved a Jewish girl who was being marched into Majdanek, hid her, got her false papers, and enabled her to survive. On the far right is Dr. Stefania Pejanowska, a physician and Polish resistance member. She was tortured by the Gestapo 15 times before being dumped in Majdanek. And there, somehow, from basically nothing, she developed an extensive infirmary that provided life-saving care to the thousands of women and children imprisoned in Majdanek. When Janina made her deliveries into Majdanek, she always encountered Dr. Pejanowska, and each wrote about the other. Even though they were under constant surveillance by the SS, they developed a wordless friendship that was deeply meaningful to both of them. In her memoir, Janina doesn't just recount what she did and witnessed. She also uses the memoir to reflect on the lessons she learned about human nature from observing it in the midst of the horrors of occupied Poland. She wrote about enemies who she knew were involved in terrible crimes, and yet who took risks to help her, on occasion even save her. And she wrote about Poles who were courageous and venal, self-sacrificing and hateful. She found that she couldn't predict whether someone would help or harm her in a given situation based only on that person's ethnicity, religion, or ideology. She also wrote very movingly about the terrible choices that we heard referred to before, the terrible choices that the Germans forced people to make between survival on the one hand, often for their families, and staying true to their principles. And she came to the following conclusion. And who is to judge the impulse to survive? Now, years later, I try not to judge, but simply to report, since we who continue as members of the human race are obliged to know its capacities, however grim and unbearable the knowledge may be. But knowledge is not the same as enduring, and I am not sure that knowledge alone gives us the right to judge. The mystery is too great how we respond to unbearable demands, because while physical and psychic tortures broke many, some reacted with what one can only call moral grandeur. I know some, and heard of many others, who helped their fellow sufferers at the cost of their own lives, who confessed to others' crimes, who willingly chose death over a degrading life. So the murder of goodness was not thorough, and this fact, too, must be reported. Janina came to see that none of us is completely defined by either the worst or the best that we do. And so she decided for herself not to judge what people did in order to survive, but simply to approach each person as a fellow member of what she called the vast, suffering human family. And if they were suffering, she thought it her human duty to relieve their suffering, to give them hope. Now, one aspect of Janina's story that is not unique is that for decades after the Holocaust, she did not tell it. And that she was like many, perhaps even most, Holocaust survivors. For some, it was too traumatic to revisit the horrors that they had suffered. But others assumed, perhaps with some justification, that no one wanted to hear their stories. Ignorance of Holocaust victims' experiences fed misconceptions, especially that the Jews reacted passively to Nazi persecution, that they went like sheep to the slaughter. Thanks to the efforts of people like Murray Pantirer and institutions like the Holocaust Resource Center to collect and make public the stories of Holocaust survivors, it has been possible to expose those misconceptions as lies. Historians now recognize that Jewish armed resistance was far more widespread than previously known, and that Jewish resistance took many other forms as well. These survivors' stories reveal, as we heard so movingly earlier, that Jews reacted to the Nazis' genocidal plans with defiance, ingenuity, courage, self-sacrifice, and heroism. We need these stories. They connect us to the individuals behind that incomprehensible number of 6 million, helping us to see them as normal people like us. And that shows us the danger that we all face when we fail to confront hatred and to protect the dignity of every single human. These stories we need also because they show us the power of individuals to make a difference. What motivated Janina to risk her life for others, to court death by going into Majdanek day after day? Henry wrote in the preface that she was guided by a simple mathematical principle. One life has a lesser value than multiple lives, and her own life would have no value if she did not use it to save others. Acting on that principle, Janina saved thousands, and in the process, she proved that one life can be a powerful force for good. Thank you.
So questions from all of you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. While you said that she did not do any work to save Jews, was she at all involved with any of the other Polish underground groups, like Żegota, which was set up to help Jews in hiding, but other groups, the AK?
So this is a great question. Żegota operated mostly in Warsaw, Kraków, not really in Lublin. But Janina was not involved in it. Not that we know of. It does not come up in her memoir, and we did not see any evidence of that from other archives. And for all our audience members, Żegota is the code name for the Council for Aid to Jews, which was actually a Polish-Jewish collaboration within the Polish resistance, an organization that helped Jews all over German-occupied Poland. But Janina believed, and wanted to believe, and was really hoping that the aid that she was providing to prisoners in Majdanek would also eventually reach Jews. She had high hopes for that. And then November 3rd, 1943 happened, when all 18,000 Jewish prisoners were shot to death on that one day.
How do you think Janina found the strength to just keep going with all the danger around her and the threats at all times?
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it? When they first got to Lublin, and she realized that they weren't safe, she was in a constant state of terror. And it got to the point when she realized that, okay, her probability as a mathematician, her specialty as a mathematician was probability. And she's going, odds of surviving are very slim. So what I need to do is just stop worrying about how to survive and figure out how to die a meaningful death. And so that's when she dedicated herself to opposing the Nazis, resisting them, and saving as many of their victims as she possibly could. And she just became obsessed with that. I mean, she was ready, willing to die as long as she could make a difference and die a meaningful death.
Hi, I'm a student at Montclair High School, and in one of the things we've talked about a lot in our Holocaust and Genocide course is the value of kind of rebuilding versus bringing perpetrators to justice. And I was wondering, in your opinion here, we obviously see a case where somebody put so much effort into preventing. How does that compare to efforts towards, I don't know, justice for perpetrators, things like that?
Right. I mean, justice for perpetrators is what I spent my professional life doing at the Department of Justice. So it is, of course, extremely important. But justice means more than just bringing perpetrators to trial. Justice, particularly for the victims, one of the aspects of justice means acknowledging what happened to them, right? And so you could see the Holocaust Resource Center as an instrument of justice by collecting the stories of the Holocaust survivors and preserving the memory and scholarship about what happened, that's a form of justice in itself.
What made you want to tell Janina's story?
Well, I mean, it was just such an incredible story, and I felt important. It was really important to tell this story, if it was true, of this Jewish woman who did these incredibly heroic things to save non-Jews. I'd never come across a story like that before. And also, I was very inspired by her memoir, by the way she wrote it, how she used it to reflect on human nature, and what she learned from that, and that lesson of, you can't just assume how people are going to react in any situation just based on their ethnicity or religion or ideology. We're all individuals, and we're not summarized by the best or the worst that we have done. We may do terrible things in some instances, but then do heroic things in others.
Sorry. Throughout your research, have you seen any testimony given that connects to her story? So any survivors that might have mentioned her help or support?
Yes, former Majdanek prisoners recalled her, definitely, and they talked about, how amazed they were at the kind of concessions she was able to win from the Germans, and how she would remain utterly calm when the SS would scream threats in her face and threaten to shoot her. So she was a memorable figure at Majdanek, and a number of prisoners credited not just her, but also the RGO and the Polish Red Cross. She ran that whole program for providing food for them, and a lot of the Polish prisoners who survived the war believed that food made the difference.
So first, thank you both. If Janina was able to witness current events, what do you think her response would be, either a message or any action that you think she would see the opportunity to take?
That's a very interesting question that you're posing. I think it is very hard to say what someone would do or think because we don't have the benefit of speaking with Janina. We also don't have any of her other, writings. We don't have a testimony that she left. We don't have any of that. So it's really difficult, and I think impossible to answer your question, which is a very interesting question. I think that for us today, it's important to draw lessons from her story in that she really tried to work together with people for a greater good. She also tried not to judge people. Barry mentioned it a few times as well. That's something that stands out to me from her story as well, that she tried to understand the other side, other perspective, where people were coming from, and not to pass judgment. So these are the main lessons I think that we should take from her story for today. I think the other part is, speaking of current events, and one other thing that I can bring up from her story is that Janina, although she was Jewish, she was not really openly Jewish because she suffered so much during the Holocaust, having to hide her identity. After the Holocaust, when she was trying to get her husband out of Poland, but also to survive herself and not reveal the people who were helping her during the war, who were members of the resistance and could have been persecuted by the communist authorities. So she had to hide her identity, most of her life. And I think that, learning from her story about what dictatorship does to you and what terror does to you and to your identity is also another lesson. But in the end, she wrote her story. She wrote it down for us to read it today, to learn from it, And she didn't deny that she was Jewish, right? So I think that's another message, another layer of her story, of this coming to terms with her identity, Jewish identity, and of presenting herself as well as a Jewish survivor.
I'm a senior at Montclair High School, and I was wondering what inspires you to continue your research on just all of the Holocaust and genocide.
Okay, so I'll answer first. Okay. Thank you for this wonderful question, and I am just so delighted. You can tell I'm, smiling by the questions from especially from students and from high school students. It's amazing that you're here and that you are engaged in the story and asking questions. So what inspires me every day? I work for an organization. It's called the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. It is the only organization, Jewish organization, that negotiates with the German government for compensation for Jewish Holocaust survivors and to secure a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors. And at the organization, and also the way I view it, is that this measure of justice, and Barry spoke about it, you can see it in different ways. This measure of justice is, of course, making sure that the Holocaust is being taught, that we learn about it, that we share these personal stories and stories of survivors, and also that we ensure that the memory of the Holocaust is secured. And of course, as with my organization, to ensure that all Holocaust survivors who are alive today, and according to the research done by the Claims Conference, there are around 250,000 Holocaust survivors alive today. So it's very important to make sure that they receive the compensation, the assistance, the aid, the medicine that they need. So this is what drives me every day, to make sure that we have Holocaust memory, research, education, and assistance for survivors.
Well, I grew up in the segregated South, and from an early age, I wrestled with the question of why people I knew who considered themselves good Christians and patriotic Americans would go along with a system that was so obviously contrary to the principles they professed to hold. And then in college, I got interested in European history, and I was really drawn to German history, because Germany in the first half of the 20th century is like the ultimate example of this human question. And then I had the opportunity to go to work for the Justice Department and really get into studying, researching the Holocaust and the perpetrators to bring them to justice. And that was very important to me, to understand who these people were and how this came about, how the horrors of the Holocaust came about. And that led me also, through my work, into investigating perpetrators of other genocides. And and I got into working in genocide prevention, because it's so important that we learn from the Holocaust and use those lessons and the lessons from the other genocides that unfortunately continue to happen, to try to prevent them, to warn the world, and try to get the world to take action when they're threatened. So that's what motivated me.
I had a question. So, while she was providing food and other supplies, were there any decisions that she had to make to avoid suspicion? Or what did she do to avoid suspicion, since she was actively aiding the people that they were imprisoned?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's incredible what she was risking. Interestingly, we don't think that anyone ever suspected that she was a Jew. So she was that convincing as the Countess. And plus, who would think that a Jew in that place and that time would be doing what she was doing? So she was sort of hiding in plain sight. But the Gestapo, the SS, did suspect her of resistance activities, and they did try to trap her. They surveilled her, and she had some very close escapes. So She could come up with a plausible excuse on the drop of a dime, though. She was amazing at that. Yes. We got.
No. Hi. I have a question. It probably is a literal answer, but it's a bit of a perspective thing. So I'm thinking about the fact that she even was able to assume any pretense of dealing with the Nazis because of her position as her pretense as a countess. And it sort of reminds me of the way the King of Denmark was able to sort of, at least for a little bit, ride his bike around, and the way that the Nazis had some tolerance for nobility. So the first part of my question is are there other accounts of the way that the Nazi Party was pretty amiable with nobility in European society to begin with? And then the follow-up is this only possible because of that analysis that the Nazis had about social hierarchy?
Yeah. Do you want it? Or? Okay. So great question. Nazi ideology didn't believe in aristocracy, but Europe was a class-conscious society, and Germany was that way as well. And so there was kind of an automatic, I wouldn't say deference exactly, but, more attention paid even to Poles if they were aristocrats. And I think that really helped her. And there was also, assuming that persona of an aristocrat, of a privileged person who takes her privilege for granted. She was really able to pull that off. We have a story in the book about a real countess who actually started the aid program in the prisons. And she was just this indomitable countess. It was very difficult to tell her no. And Janina used that very much to her advantage.
Hi, I'm a student from MHS, and I was just wondering, could you guys talk a little bit about how you really found all this information for the book? I know you originally talked about how you got this booklet from a professor about Janina, but how did you really go about researching her life and what she did?
What a wonderful question. How much time do we have for this? Because kind of the way I talk about it and think about this process is as detective work. And this detective work involved looking in archives for historical records. It also involved doing a lot of genealogical research, which I learned in this, in this process, and this was really exciting. But we looked in a variety of archives, but I will just tell you an example. Because otherwise we would spend here, hours. So you heard from Justin's introduction of me. I used to work at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. It's the joint. It's the American. It's the American Jewish arm of relief for Jews worldwide. And the GDC has amazing archives, and they're available online. And if you're a history student looking for some good topic or to do research, or be a teacher and want to assign some historical research to your students, look on the JDC archives. So that's the plug. But I used to work there, and I knew some of the collections and the numbering of the cataloging and so on. So when Barry and I first started looking for the documents, it occurred to me to look in the JDC archives, and I did find a reference number, which then I knew to look for records of another organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. That's how it was established in the 19th century to help Jewish refugees in the U.S. The HIAS records are held at another Jewish archive at YIVO, Institute for Jewish Research in New York, which actually started back in Eastern Europe. So you see the different connections, right? And these archives are closed to researchers, but I spoke with the archivist, who very graciously agreed for me to view those records, and those were those illuminated a whole its entire story that Barry and I did not know, and we would have no way of knowing if it wasn't for those records. The file was of letters that Henry Mehlberg, so Janina's husband, was sending to Jewish relief organizations, begging them to help him get his wife out of Poland. And in those letters, he referred to, his wife, but also some of the letters referred to, Suchodolski, right? So this is how we were able to connect the last names, and this is the same person, Janina Mehlberg and Janina Suchodolska. That was her wartime alias. Another very important collection was thanks to Adara's suggestion. Adara, I hope you know, she's an expert on Canadian Jewish history. She wrote a wonderful book about Holocaust survivors in Canada. So she knows all the archives. And when Adara and I had a conversation about, where to look, you heard that the Mehlbergs arrived in Canada, right? So of course, we needed to look in Canadian archives. And another wonderful archivist, this was during a COVID lockdown, so we couldn't travel during that time, and so we relied on the assistance of many people. And this Canadian archivist sent us a file that explained to us, how Janina ended up in Canada, that she escaped. We don't know how, no one knows how she escaped, but that she escaped and that she found her way through the Canadian representation and then reunited with Henry. So these are just some of the, unique kind of records that come to my mind right now, because we can talk for hours.
Hi, I'm also a student from MHS, and I just wanted to clarify, did she make up a new role as Countess, or did she assume the identity of someone else? And if so, were people ever suspicious of looking for records of the existence of a Countess by going by that name, or how did she pull that off?
Oh, there are so many questions that we would love to be able to answer, and that's one of them. So I think she thought that there was a Countess Suchodolska whose identity that she had, but we have not been able to trace such a person. All we know is that she had false identity papers that Shkinsky apparently arranged for her to get through his resistance contacts. So that's as much as we know. Yeah.
And we have our last question over here.
I was curious, I know you said that the RGO was tolerated by the German government allowing the aid, but how were they able to come up with the quantity of food and supplies that they needed? Because I'm sure the government wasn't giving them money to do that. And when you were running down, the tons of soup, et cetera, how was that organization able to come up with all of that to then get into the camps?
Yeah. Especially given that the Poles themselves were living under starvation rations under the German occupation. They did get a little bit of money from a tax that the Germans levied, so there was some income from that. Until the U.S. entered the war at the end of 1941, they were also getting support from organizations in the U.S. and some international organizations. But then it was pretty much up to the Polish people, who were, many of them, suffering from malnutrition, to donate the goods, particularly that were used for the prisoners at Majdanek. And it's a real testament to, the generosity and solidarity of the Poles, that so many of them did donate food. And like, for example, there's a chapter in the book about Christmas at Majdanek. So I mentioned Janina persuaded the commandant to let her deliver decorated Christmas trees to Majdanek. And she organized the people of Lublin to send in these food packages, which were supposed to contain certain restricted ingredients, but they were sending in all kinds of sumptuous things, babkas and hams and so forth, in these packages. And at the same time, she brought in her delivery, instead of the usual soup and bread, she had egg noodles with poppy seeds and borscht and stew and things like that. And she was almost caught. And she also brought in Holy Communion wafers so that the Poles could celebrate communion. And this Christmas at Majdanek was a deeply meaningful experience for all the prisoners, Polish prisoners who survived and were there at Christmas, talk about it, and about how this was an almost spiritual experience for them. So they came together to celebrate Christmas and feel this connection to the people outside the camp, know that they had not been forgotten, that there were people who cared about them.